The last of the pre-imperial three dynasties is the Zhou, who overthrew the Shang around 1045 BCE. They would still be there nearly 800 years later. China's later dynasties wouldn't last half as long. The Zhou came from the Wei Valley and were vassals to the Shang. But getting tired of that, they caught up their armies, marched in the Shang territory, and whooped them at the Battle of Muye. Zhou crossed the Yellow River with the army of 50,000 men, initially greatly outnumbered. Their fortunes drastically improved when 170,000 slaves that had been armed to protect the capital city defected and joined the Zhou. The defeated Shang king fled back to his palace, had himself a little bit of a cry, and then burned the palace down with himself inside it. This posed a question to the Chinese. The Shang ruled because heaven had given them the right to rule. How could Zhou just come along and overthrow them? Surely the Zhou were in the wrong here. Luckily, the Zhou had an answer. Heaven had dumped the Shang. Why? We will come to this a bit later. Unlike the king of Shang, who ruled a very centralized state, the Zhou implemented a system based around semi-independent feudal states governed by the king's 16 brothers, other family members, and in-laws. Zhou's first king, Wu, would only rule for 3 years. When his son succeeded him to the throne, a massive rebellion erupted. Shang loyalists joined together with discontented nobles, including 3 of the young king's uncles. However, another uncle Dan, the Duke of Zhou, the deceased king's older brother, stayed loyal to the young king. As regent, he defeated the rebellion and his younger brothers in a 3-year war, and then consolidated and expanded the kingdom and developed the mandate of heaven doctrine to justify the divine right to rule over the Zhou. Because the Shang had become corrupt and decadent. Well, according to ancient Chinese historian Sima Qian, the last Shang king may have hosted some festive orgies and written some extremely pornographic poems and tortured a bunch of people, and maybe, just maybe, built himself a giant alcohol lake, and inside of the previously said alcohol lake, built a meat forest. Heaven frowns on that kind of behavior. This resulted in the Shang losing heaven's mandate, which heaven was happy to transfer to a more virtuous people, like the Zhou. From now, heaven would throw storms, earthquakes, and peasant uprisings at rulers that it saw as unfit. If rulers didn't listen and change, the mandate of heaven would fall from their grasp and into another's. The mandate of heaven became central to Chinese politics, as different dynasties lost and claimed the mandate for the next few thousand years. The Duke of Zhou also established a new eastern capital city at Luoyang to administer the eastern portion of the kingdom. Once the young king came of age, he gave up power, stepping down his regent without any trouble or conflict. The Duke of Zhou is still revered today in China as an example of loyalty. Under the Zhou, China's first classics texts, the 5 classics, were written. Irrigation and food controls sprang up along with a large bureaucracy. A network of canals were built to transport food and luxuries. Zhou's elite families could live in fancy walled cities and enjoy poetry and silk clothing, or commanding large armies and taxing the peasants. It was a time of immense change. Iron appeared in China around the 9th century BCE, about 1,000 years later than in the Middle East. But the Chinese quickly became experts. Europe and the Middle East could not figure out how to melt iron, so were forced to use wrought iron, which is terrible. By the 4th century BCE, the Chinese were using heat-resistant clay in their furnaces, which allowed them to reach temperature of over 1,537 degrees Celsius. So they could liquefy iron and cast it into molds. This technology wouldn't reach Europe for another 1,800 years, and this gave the Chinese much stronger tools and weapons that could be produced on a massive scale. Trade kicked off as the population soared to 15 million, and cities turned into manufacturing centers. Chinese silk has been discovered as far away as Germany in the 6th century BCE, suggesting that the famous Silk Road was already emerging. The Zhou started using money, which was a novel idea at the time. It was shaped like knives or spades, which seems inconvenient. But they were figuring things out. The Zhou kingdom had an issue though. It was very decentralized. It was a feudal state, so the king handed out his lands to lords. But these local lords began to amass more and more power, and the Zhou began to lose control of their own kingdom. In 1771 BCE, the Zhou capital was sacked, and they fled to a new capital at Luoyang. The Zhou still had about 500 years left in them, but at this point, they were just puppets to the much more powerful vassals. This ended the Western Zhou period and began the Eastern Zhou period. This period is divided into 2 parts, both named after the historical texts that record them, the Spring and Autumn Annals and the Warring State Annals. At the beginning of the Spring and Autumn period, 148 states were all fighting to be top dog. This whittled down to about 30 or so, and in the highly violent warring states period, it down to 7 and then 3 and then finally 1. Despite the violence and the chaos of this age, it was also an age of profound philosophical thought, with the philosopher Lao Tzu emphasized living in harmony with the natural world. Confucius, the founder of Confucianism, believed justice, peace, and properly acting on one's role in life were the greatest aims for a person and a society. Han Fei's doctrines of legalism taught that people were selfish and needed strict restrictions placed upon them in order for society to function properly. These ideas heavily influenced Chinese bureaucratic administration for millennia to come. Sun Tzu, a military advisor and general for the state of Wu, wrote down a military treatise, The Art of War. The strategies in this book have been employed in Asia warfare ever since they were written down, and later have been heavily used in the West, and even in the business world, and remains a bestseller even to this day. Eventually, all of the warring states were unified by China's first emperor, Ching Shi Huang, in 221 BC, who had conquered the Zhou 35 years before, putting an end to the Bronze Age, beginning China's Imperial Age. Bronze Age China saw the oldest continuous civilization that still exists today, with its contemporary Bronze Age Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Near Eastern civilizations fading away. China's geographical isolation and distinct natural borders fostered a unique culture which, during the Bronze Age, looked at itself as not the greatest civilization, but the only civilization. Beginning in the Zhou dynasty and perhaps before, they began referring to their own country as the Middle Kingdom, China being the modern name. They viewed the French states that surrounded their territory as barbarians who made pale imitations of their own culture. The most impressive of these was the state of Shu, which created some of the most impressive bronze work ever created. Interestingly, China's population greatly increased during the spring and autumn and the warring states period, with these states making up over a quarter of the world's population of the time. This was largely due to the advances in irrigation and farming technology, the wide implementation of coinage throughout the Eastern Zhou period facilitated a robust economy that seemed to thrive in whatever states were not being currently ravaged by the horrors of war, and saw the emergence for the first time of a large middle class in Asia, where those who were not hereditary landowners could purchase land with money they had accumulated.